Well, good morning. All right, excited to see everybody in our first gathering of 2022. Whether you're here at 601 Fairview Street or you're watching online, I know there are a lot of people who are quarantining or come in close contact. So even as soon as this morning, we found out people who weren't going to be able to make it today who are watching online. So we're glad that you guys are taking those precautions. So today is a throwback. And as you can see from our graphic, as you can hear from the songs that we played, when I look at the graphic, all that comes to my mind is in West Philadelphia, born and raised. There you go. All right. Or Saved by the Bell, or, whatever you need to do. But the idea that we want to go back, and even as some of the songs that we've sung today, I flashed back to 2000s with my Saturn coupe with a 5 disc change in the back, and switching out that Passion 2000. Yes, for you college kids who just went to Passion was around in the ancient days of 2000, Y2K, and Sonic Flood, and some of these songs that we're singing now. And some of you are like, I've never heard any of these songs. For you young whippersnappers, this is when worship music was real worship music 25 years ago. But no, we're glad you guys are here. And if you're like, hey, I'm glad we're celebrating 13 years. This is my first time, or I've just started coming this fall. This is going to be a really cool service, and really this whole month, because today we're going to be doing a little bit of looking back and then also looking forward. And you're like, well, Walt, why do you make such a big deal about your birthday? Well, because one, we think Christians should throw more parties. We don't think Christ followers throw enough parties. We have we can have the label, rightfully so, a lot of times, as we're stick in the muds and we don't like to have fun. We take ourselves too seriously or too self-righteous. But we think the church should throw more parties, so we like to throw a party every year. And we've done little touches where you guys, well, you don't usually give out donut holes. That goes all the way back to 13 years ago over at the activity center. We used to do that, and just some of the fun things we've added today. But also, God made it very clear to Israel. He said, hey, you need to look back. Don't forget what I have done, because don't forget my faithfulness. Don't forget my goodness. Don't forget how I have been alongside of you this whole way. Because when Israel would go sideways is when it would forget to look back, and they would think it's more about what they did than what God had done. And so that's every year we love to look back and be faithful of what God has done, because this is not a celebration. As you heard Chris say, this is not a celebration of us and what we've accomplished. This is what Christ has done in and through us, and if we're really honest, in spite of us. All right, the idea that we would plant this church 13 years ago, literally across the street, right over in the activity center, not really knowing who was going to come. We had a handful of people, but in the end showed up over 200 people. You're like, whoa, don't worry, the next week it was only 100. So we ran off half the people the very first week. And then God was just faithful, and then we, God did a lot of in those early days. But my son, who's 13 years old, he was 5 months old. We look back to some pictures from 13 years ago, and apparently I've aged in 13 years, believe it or not. I look a lot different. But so why we study and why we want to look back is understanding we want to go, God, this is your church. We have not just sat back and watched, but we've said, Lord, all right, Lord, what would it look like for you to start a new church here in Fountain Inn? And what would it like for you to lead us and guide us? And understand, a lot of people are like, when we started the church, go, well, do you hate the church? Are you mad at the church? We're like, no. Or do you guys think you can do church better? Why do we need another church? That was further from the truth. We loved the churches of Fountain Inn 13 years ago. We thought they were doing a great job. But we also learned and looked at studies that 60% of the people who lived in Fountain Inn then would never darken the door of established churches. And so our goal was to go, hey, most established churches are fighting for 40% of our population. What would you like to start a church that reached for the 60%? The 60% that didn't fit into other churches, or 60% that had never been to church, or 60% that never felt comfortable. We said then, and we still do, that we're kind of the island of misfit toys, that we don't really fit into other churches, and we don't fit into big churches or small churches or traditional churches or way contemporary churches with smoke and all that other stuff. But we're kind of this, we set on the idea of going, we wanted to be a unique church that, again, that not because we thought we could do church better, but we thought that we wanted to be very specific. And we asked God, and we asked the people who were with us in those early days, going, hey, what do you want to be known for? Do you want to be known for, hey, we got the coolest music, or hey, the deepest messages, or the coolest building, or the best show? Like, what is it that you want to be known for? And for the people that had gathered around us in those early days, some people had never been to church. Some people had been to church. Some people were just finding Jesus along the way, and they loved what we were doing, so they kind of started hanging out with us too. But everyone said, hey, we want to be known as the church that serves. And so that's really been our calling card for the last 13 years, is the idea that we wanted to be the church that was known with a heart for our community. And if you're in the last 13 years, we've moved different places and we've had lots of different seasons, which we're going to talk a lot about today. But if you ask people in our community, hey, do you know someone who goes to Capstone? Yeah, probably. Or you know something Capstone's done? Yeah. Or the idea that they know what Capstone's about. But if you ask, hey, who's the pastor at Capstone? And ultimately they were like, we don't really know. We know what Capstone does, and we know the environment, and we know what they're passionate about, but the idea that it's personality-driven or the idea that it's entertainment-driven, that's not really who we were, and that's not what we've tried to be. We haven't tried to copy other churches. We've been very unique, and that's what we continue to strive. One of the verses that really shaped us and molded us was Jeremiah 29:7. And we could look at Luke 15 was another one that shaped us, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. That shaped us, but this was one that really did give us direction of who we wanted to be. It said, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. This is Jeremiah, and they're in bondage in Babylon. And ultimately God says, hey, I put you here for a reason, and I want you to pray for the benefit and the blessing of the city. And where the city is doing really well, then you as the church will do really well. Normally, what we've seen in the past is that there are a lot of churches can just exist in the city, but the idea that one that would be for the city, that's kind of what God was calling us to do and to be. And so for us, if we had 1,000 people here on Sunday, but our city was still continuing to decline, then that's not seeking the welfare of the city. And so for the last 13 years, that's the mission that we've been on. Now, some of you guys are here because you wanted to join us in that mission. Some of you are here because we blessed you and we were able to serve you and you got to see who Jesus was. Some of you met a neighbor who had been at Capstone and they shared the gospel with you and they invited you in. But along the way, there's lots of people who've come to join us in this mission of being a unique church for the city. But just to be honest, in the world of church planning, a lot of people have left as well. A lot of people said, hey, you've got to be more than this. You've got to just be more than blessing the city and seeking the city and discipleship. We want you to be more about programs. We want you to be more about entertainment. And we're just honestly, this is who God's called us to be. And that's one of the things we want to celebrate this morning. And just because other churches, by the way, a lot of people are like, well, do you think everybody else is wrong? No. We love churches who have choirs. We love churches who do Sunday school. We love churches who fill in the blank. Just because someone else does it different than us doesn't mean it's wrong. This is just who God called us to be. And the idea that we wanted to see so many people who made up our church. Because here's the thing, is that there are people here who grew up Baptist and Presbyterian and Methodist and Catholic, and those who didn't grow up in church at all. They're conservative and they're liberals. There's the haves and the have-nots. There of those who have battled through self-righteousness and the idea of pride, and those who've dealt with addiction. And yet under this banner of the gospel, people who normally wouldn't hang out together come together, and you sing these songs that we're coming back to the heart of worship. That you serve side by side in understanding and paying it forward what Christ has done for us in order to bless others. And that's the beauty of the gospel. It's not division, but unity. And that's what we've seen. And again, that's what we celebrate this morning as well, is the idea of the eclectic group of just the society and culture that we live in. So again, as we think about the last 13 years, I really thought about the idea of seasons, and that's kind of where we're going to talk about today. And again, seasons are just a vital part of Scripture. And as we talk about that, there's obviously a lot of us know Ecclesiastes 3:1. It says this. It says that there's a time for everything and a season for every activity and the heavens. So Ecclesiastes, King Solomon writes, look, there's a season for this and a season for that. Tomorrow night, we will mourn the ending of another season called college football. And we'll hold each other and we'll cry together and we'll be okay until the next 9 months. But there are seasons, and we're going to talk about some of the seasons of Capstone in the past and in the future. And then Galatians 6:9 says this, let us do not grow weary of doing good, for in the due seasons we will reap if we do not give up. I've had to read that verse several times because I'm going to be honest, in this last season that we've been in, this COVID season, I've wanted to give up. I know there are a lot of people who've stopped coming to church because they give up. I know a lot of people they've given up on lots of things in this past season. But Galatians 6:9, let me just read this over to you if you've had that same mentality. But let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due seasons we will reap if we do not give up. And so today we're just going to kind of walk through some of the seasons that Capstone has been through, what we've learned, which, by the way, we've made tons of mistakes. We have, when I was 30, when we planted this church, I had never been in this position before. I had never planted a church before. I had never led a church before. I had been on staff with churches. I had been in ministry for a while. But the idea that I learned at 30 and at 43, I still, just FYI, have no idea what I'm doing. And until y'all bring somebody who does, you're stuck with me. And so the idea that we've made mistakes along the way, we've admitted those, we've confessed those to you guys, and we'll no doubt that we'll make them again. But as we look and study, some of you guys are going to get a history lesson. Some of you guys are going to hit playback, and you're going to remember some of the things I'm going to talk about. Some of you're going to get excited about, man, that's a rich history. And then we're going to end with kind of where we're going. So the first season was this. This is our planting season. Like I said, 13 years ago, we started across the street. It was full of uncertainty. There were lots of experiments that were happening because honestly, 13 years ago, churches, what we call a missional, attractional church, didn't really exist. We were kind of on the forefront of the idea of blessing the city and all the things that we want to do, be a missionary, we work, learn, live, and play, but ultimately say, hey, how can we transform our culture with the gospel? And so we had crazy ideas where we went over to Haiti and we started working with an orphanage there and church planting in Haiti. We started discussing about a nonprofit called Fight that would later come to about, that we ended up planting a church in Clinton in these years. And the idea that we were just, that we were too young and too dumb to think, oh, there's no way we could do it. Because we didn't have time, we didn't have money, but we had God, kind of like some of you guys who are just living on love in marriage. The idea that, man, we're just too young to know that we can't really or shouldn't be able to accomplish these things. So we saw many people baptized. We saw huge crowds at the community egg drop. Some of you guys remember that. The first year we hired a hot air balloon and struggled to get it up because it was very windy that day. And we dumped about 5,000 eggs, plastic eggs, down into a crowd of children. It's candy filled. And then we did a helicopter the next 2 years. It grew to get thousands of people. And when people started fighting over Chick-fil-A cows dropped from helicopters, we decided this was crazy and we're not going to do this anymore. But the idea that we saw thousands upon thousands of people showing up and churches working together. We saw lots of what God was doing and working in these first 3 years. It was fun. It was exciting. It was nervous. But we didn't really know that a storm was kind of brewing called year 4, which was pruning. John 15 is very clear. Jesus says this. Jesus says those things that connect to the vine will grow. But there's also things that healthy things grow, but then also healthy things are pruned as well. That sometimes there's dead weight. Sometimes there are things that are holding back growth. And as much as we didn't like it, that year 4 was kind of our year of pruning, where we had numerous families who said, hey, this was really cool these first 3 years, but when are you going to become a real church? Like, when are we going to start doing children's choir? Like, when are we really going to start doing programs? Like, when are we really going to start doing the stuff that real churches do? I was like, well, we're not, because we're kind of unique, and our mission and vision, Jeremiah 29:7, Luke 15, like the idea that we want to be for the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. And they were like, well, we want to go back. We want to go back to what we know. We want to go back to what's comfortable. We want you to plan all our stuff for us and give us mission versus the idea of giving yourself and finding mission, being families on mission. So with all these families that left, we had about $40,000 walk out of our tithes and offerings. We had about a third of our budget walk out. I was beginning to look for another job. John Dukes was beginning to look for another job, who was our worship pastor at that time. And we really didn't think this was going to be the end. I literally prayed this prayer. I said, God, if this is it, if we're done, I'm cool with that, because most churches, by the way, never make it to their 5th birthday. Never. And so I was like, all right, God, we're a part of statistics. I'm fine with that. I'll go find another job. I'll get out of ministry, whatever I need to do. But Lord, I just want to be faithful. So God, I need to know, are we done, or do you have more? And I can tell you where I was sitting in the ghetto Bilo, which is that's where we met over there. And the ghetto Bilo, some of you guys remember, I still have PTSD because when my fingers get cold, I go back to sitting in 40-degree weather in my office. But I remember where I was sitting in the ghetto Bilo when I asked that question, and God said, hey, I'm not done with Capstone. that I know is really hard right now, and I know it doesn't look like you're going to be able to pay bills. We literally didn't have enough money to pay payroll. But he says, I'm not done with you. I'm not done with Capstone. I said, all right. And so we kept plugging along, and we kind of got back on our feet, and the Lord blessed us. Someone stole our trailer, and luckily the insurance company gave us money to make payroll. True story. If we ever see a Woody Woodpecker trailer, don't ever stop it, okay? Some of it, we should have a picture of that somewhere. I don't know where, but it had a giant Woody Woodpecker on the back of it. Anyway, I digress. So there was this pruning season. We were going through a lot of hard, but then God led us into this merger season, which was years 5 and 6. God was working behind the scenes and preparing Fairview Street Baptist Church, who was meeting here, 100-year-old church that was a part of the Mill Hill. It was first Second Baptist Church, and then it changed its name to Fairview Street because one of the deacons said, we're not going to be second to anybody. So and a lot of the people at Fairview Street learned that in this process, because when we talked about the name change, they're like, we don't want to change our name. And Miss Polly stood up and said, why? We've changed our name before. And all the churches like, what are you talking about? She said, oh, yeah, we used to be Second Baptist Church. And they go, well, I guess it doesn't really matter what we're known as. But God was using a 100-year-old church that was full of senior saints that didn't have a lot of young families, and they were kind of struggling by. And almost Kermit Morris was the transition pastor who had helped us plant 5 years earlier. And the idea that he brought these two families together. We were a young church that was we knew we were going to be out of the buy-low in a little bit. And God just kind of brought these two families together. And ultimately the idea, and I still brag on our Fairview Street family, that I told them, I said, hey, don't do this so you have a place to worship for the next 10 or 15 years. I say, do this for your sons and your grandkids who don't know Jesus. That we would stand on your shoulders and be able to continue the work of Fairview Street that started 100 years ago, that we continue that here at 601 Fairview Street. And man, they blessed us in such a way that we were just a ragtag young church that we had zero assets to our name. And then they blessed us with 5 acres, this building, which equaled almost $500,000 overnight. And so the idea that God's hand, even though I wanted to give up a year earlier, and a lot of people may have given up, but the idea of going, no, God's like, hey, I got something bigger and better for you if you don't give up. Remember what Galatians says, keep at it, don't give up. So God's sovereignty brought us together, continued to work through Fairview Street. And again, we said, look, we just don't want a good story, we want a God story. We want a God story. So that leads us to the next season, which was the fruitful season, years 7 through 10. Again, a lot of people doubted that this would work as we talk about a 100-year-old church and a 5-year-old church plant coming together, senior saints and a punk pastor coming together. Like, there's no way that could work, but man, God's hand was all over that, and we just saw a beautiful transition of beginning to go, hey, what's it like to do ministry together? What's it like to become a multi-generational church? What's it begin to go, hey, how can we use this not just as a place of worship on Sunday, but a hub of ministry throughout the week? And we've been able to see that happen again and again and again. We saw our generosity double. We saw our reaching, the folks we were able to reach were increased over 40%. We did an expansion. I did. By the way, there was no way I thought we could do this. When we said, hey, we need to raise $300,000. At the time, our budget was $300,000. I was like, there's no way we can raise $300,000 and make budget. But through the faithfulness of you guys and our family, we were able to pay that off in 2 years. And God just continued to go, hey, if you have the faith to do it, hey, I'm going to bless it. And so we continue to see God work in huge ways. Man, in 2019, we were at an all-time high in attendance, averaging over 350. Our giving was at an all-time high, man. In 2020, we met together and we kind of cast our 2020 vision with clarity. And man, 2020 is going to be the greatest year ever. And then God said, not so fast there. Just like so many others, we entered this next season, which was the COVID season. And so in this COVID season, again, years 11 through 12, these really last year, that just like the rest of the world, just like every church, every city, every nation, every family, we had to deal with this. And this has been, for me, one of the hardest seasons of leadership, of trying to figure out. Because pretty much we made everybody mad. We didn't do enough. We did too much. We were trying to just listen to the Lord and just begin, again, the idea that we would keep it in between the ditches. We had to adapt. We had to pivot. And simply it's been about surviving. And this season we've seen pruning again. So some people, luckily, we are not this case. By the way, there are churches who lost over half of their seniors. They lost 10 to 20 to 30 seniors because of, and other people, middle-aged as well, But the idea that they lost to COVID to death, but we didn't really lose that many, I don't think really any to death. But the idea was we did lose people because they just got out of the rhythm of going to church, or they stopped seeing it as important or as a need, or they kind of got out of community, or they started attending another church. But there's been a pruning in the last 2 years, and the idea of going, hey, what's this look like? So it just hasn't been challenges either. It hasn't just been difficulties. It led to a lot of innovation, a lot of positive realizations that, hey, we can move forward with some things that we've been praying about, that we aren't in control. That ultimately we can have the 2020 vision, but God's still in control of all that happens, because he said, this is not our church. This isn't my church. This is his church. And we're just stewards and say, okay, God, whatever situation we're in, we're going to listen to you. We're going to trust you and where you're going to take us and what that looks like. And so we've learned that and how to be effective during this difficulty. So this season meant we had to draw closer to each other and community, except through the whole social distancing thing. But we had to draw closer and depending on each other. And sometimes we were in lockdown and we had to take people food and leave it on their doorsteps. And other times we had to make sure that we could help people out and get them to doctor's visit. But it drew us closer together as a Capstone family. But then also, hopefully, it drew us closer to the Lord. That we spent that time, and again, we spent less time listening to talking heads on social media and news, but we dove into God's word and listened to what he said. But today, I really believe this is sending us into a new season. So just like the last 2 years have been keeping us between the ditches, because it would have been very easy to get blown over by the pandemic and get stuck in this ditch, or get blown over by the politic mess that we've been seeing in the last 2 years, or the idea of the social unrest, or the idea of just honestly people losing their minds because they're debating about all these other things and they care more about winning a debate than actually making a difference, and they kind of left Jesus off to the side because they wanted to prove a point. So it would have been very easy for us to get stuck in one of these ditches. But the idea is that we've worked really hard, and honestly, it's been what we had to focus on the most. Was going, hey, how do we keep this and not get stuck in this argument and not get stuck in this debate? And again, at some point, making a lot of people mad, and some people don't go here anymore because of the decisions that we made. But ultimately, the idea of going, hey, how do we stay true to this vision 13 years ago that God called us to go on? Most sociologists all agree that COVID will have its own chapter in history. That we most agree that we're kind of on the back end. We're still in the midst of COVID. Please don't hear me say that it's fake or that we're not all getting sick, because people are. But the idea that we're towards the back end of this thing, and the idea that as we get to the end of it, that it's just not going to end a time period or a chapter, but it's actually going to usher in an entire new history, a new era in human history. So the idea that we're going to move from one era to another, and that COVID is really going to be the one that spins us around. And so most sociologists believe that we are kind of in this gray zone. There's transition between now and the future. So there's this now, and then there's where we're headed. Most scholars agree. They don't really know how long it's going to be. It might be 5 or 6 years till we see what the new era looks like. It may be dominated by the crazy thing called Web3 and the metaverse and all the crazy stuff that's coming out in the last year that you're going to hear about. But the idea of going, hey, this next era is coming, and the question is, what does it look like? And what does it look like as we see this gray zone? And so we've seen this throughout the transitions from era to era, and the idea that even in the Bible, most well known, it's in the story of Israel when they leave Egypt and they're called to the promised land. But there's this gray zone, or known as the desert, where they got to go through this desert. So the idea of going, hey, we're leaving Egypt. We're going to the promised land, so we're going from one era to another era. But the idea of going, but in between there's a lot of uncertainty. In between there, we really don't know where we're going, but we're going to trust. In between, in the desert or in the gray zone, we got to follow Moses, and we got to follow the pillar of fire and smoke. And so as we talk about that, they followed Moses, unsure where they were going. Now, before you go, well, that sounds like bad news. You have to remember, and we talked about this fall, that the desert prepared Moses to do what he didn't think he could do. That the desert prepared Israel to do what they didn't think they could do. The first time, the reason they spent 40 years in the desert was because they didn't think they could take those giants. So guess what they did? God said, all right, I'm going to prepare you for what's coming next. And so I really believe that before we get all down and go, well, in this gray zone, this desert area, this doesn't sound very fun. Ultimately, it may not be fun, but we need to learn that God might be preparing us and shaping us for what the next era looks like. Now, there's going to be people, and there are tons of churches who are already saying this. Hey, I want to go back. I want to go back to the way it used to be, to where it was comfortable, to where I knew what to understand about church and what church looked like when I grew up. And we can always go back. Because in Israel's story, that's why they went to Moses. Hey, Moses, we want to go back. Like we ate fish and we knew what we were doing and we weren't just roaming around the desert. Like we want to go back, even if it means bondage. And there's many churches that are open today that will not be open in the next 5 to 10 years because that's their mentality. They said, hey, I don't want to learn from history. I don't want to learn from scripture, but I want to go back. I want to go back to the way it was before. I can tell you that we as Capstone are not going to go back, but it ushers in this new season as we lean into it. We're calling it Advance. And so as we move into this new season, literally starts today, but we're heading into this advanced season. So over the last 2 years, we focused on many things that were out of our control. We couldn't control a pandemic. We couldn't control politics. We couldn't control the social unrest. And ultimately, the idea is going, man, we just want to keep going in the same direction. We'll make sure we go the right direction. And so as we talk about that, it's easy to get lost and confused and frustrated. And there's going to be a lot of churches, and even some of you, who are going to get lost and confused and frustrated because you're like, I don't really know what's going on. I really can't make sense of what's happening. There were 10 earthquakes in South Carolina. Does that mean Jesus is coming back? I'll give you what I tell everyone else. Here's what I know. We're closer today than we were yesterday, all right? Like, there's fires, and is Jesus coming back? Maybe. What does it mean about the stock market? What does it mean about inflation? What does it mean about this? Those are things I cannot control, but it's easy to get caught up in those things of stuff we can't control. So as we talk about that, let's look at Philippians 1, verse 12. And this is kind of going to be our go-to as we discuss this. Is I want you to know, brothers, that all that has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. So this is Paul. Now remember what's happened to Paul. He's been shipwrecked. He's been in prison. He's been beaten. He's been stoned. He's done all these things. And as he's writing to the church of Philippi, he says, hey, everything that's happened to me has been in order to advance the gospel. So let's fit this in your life and begin to listen. Okay, the idea of what's happened in the last 2 years has been in order for you to advance the gospel. Through the struggle of the last 10 years has been in order for you to advance the gospel. Too many of us take and say, there's no way that God could use me, fill in the blank, losing my job, going bankruptcy, having a miscarriage, going through a divorce, whatever it may be. There's no way that I lost my sense of smell a year ago and can't taste anything. There's no way God can use those things. But as we look at Philippians 1, it says this, all this happened to me, there's one reason for it, to advance the gospel. That was the purpose that Paul saw and understood. And so as we think of that and we understand of what that looks like, we need to apply that to our lives. Everything that is happening, the pruning and the growing. The last 2 years, we've been pruned, but yet we've also grown by 30% during COVID. The idea that we've seen triumphs, but also challenges, have all been for the advancement of the gospel. So as we start this new season today, whether it's in the midst of a storm that you're in right now, because we talk about this all the time, you're either in the beginning of, either you're heading into a storm, in the midst of a storm, or coming out of a storm. And I believe that we're kind of on the back end of storm and heading into out of a storm, which is why we got to begin to go, what's next as we move forward? Because when we're in those things, there's two paths that we could take. One is confusion. What's happening? What's going to do? Where am I going to go? Then questioning, hey, am I heading in the right direction? So that confusion sets in, and then that questioning me going, what am I supposed to be doing? Where am I supposed to be going? Do I have what it takes to make it through? And then last is fear. I can't do this. I can't handle this. I can't move forward. And so we retreat. We go to Moses and say, hey, I want to go back to Egypt. I know you're talking really good about this promised land, but I can't do it. I don't want to do it. I'd rather go back and be in bondage than advance into the promised land. The other option is this, is that there's clarity. Hey, I know where I'm going, which leads to confidence. Hey, if I know where I'm going, I can do the hard things that are a part of the journey. And then it leads to courage. I'm not afraid to go forward. I'm not afraid to face the Goliaths. I'm not afraid to face the uncertainty. I'm not afraid to face the risk because I know it, which then gives us the courage to advance. So we can be in confusion, leads us to questioning, leads us to fear and retreat. Hey, let's go back. Or we can say, hey, you know what? There's clarity of where we're going. There's confidence in what we're doing. There's courage to do the hard things in order to advance the gospel. That's where we as a church have come to, that in January 2022, even in the midst still of this uncertainty gray zone, that we want to say, hey, in the next 3 years, we're going to say, hey, these are the 3 things that we want to accomplish. And the rest of this month, we're going to get through the strategies of all those. So those 3 things look like this. You'll see it on the screen. One is developing missionary disciples. So you're going to hear us talk about missionary disciples. We're going to talk about why we need to be better missionary disciples, where we work, learn, live, and play. So we have targets that we talk about as disciples. So the idea of going, hey, as a disciple, I know where I should be going and what I should be doing. But we're going to give you some more tools. You're going to hear about some of the things that we have planned in order to create some deeper, because I believe that as we head into this desert, that as we get into the post-Christian society, that you as disciples are going to have new tools to share the gospel. You're going to have to learn how to have conversations. And I'll be honest, we're really going to have to learn to listen more than debate as the church. We've got to listen more to debate. So the understanding of developing these missionary disciples. So we want you to begin to think about spiritual disciplines and your discipleship tools and being a family on mission. So we're going to talk about that for the next 3 years. We're going to dig deep into creating you as you're like, well, Walt, I'm a pretty good disciple. And again, status quo is not enough. You should be closer to Jesus today than you were yesterday. You need to be closer to Jesus in 2023 than you were in 2022. And ultimately, we want to say in 2025, we want you to write down some things that are going here. I want to memorize an entire chapter of the New Testament. Guess what? Let's put it on there. In 3 years, you got to work on it. But let's begin to go, hey, what are the things I need to do to be a better developing these missionary disciples? Next, multiplying gospel community. So 13 years ago, we wanted to be a part of a movement. The idea of a multiplying gospel movement. So the idea of this, is bigger than ourselves. So that's why we started FIKE, and it's not under the umbrella of Capstone, but it's the idea that it is a 501c3, that when we started Haiti Gospel Fund, it's the idea that it's a whole new movement that's a part of a national thing that works to develop other people. The idea of planting more churches and the idea of all the things that we do. It's not the idea that we just want a bunch of credit for a bunch of programs, but we really want to start movements here in our city. We want to start movements in the state of South Carolina. I want to start a movement that literally transforms small towns in South Carolina. That I want to see a church plant movement that Capstone is either sending or training in every small town in South Carolina, where there are 1.2 million people who do not have access to the modern gospel as we know it. So the understanding, beginning to ask those questions. Hey, let's be a part of a movement. So we'll talk some about that. And then increasing kingdom impact. So in the Lord's Prayer, he said, look, the Lord's Prayer is your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And the way we describe that at Capstone is making things the way God intended them to be. So there's some things that we want to do that from, hey, this fall we unveiled our master plan for this 5 acres of beginning to build a community center where a church meets in. And we had basketball courts and coffee shops, and we had offices and counseling centers and all this cool stuff. And we're going to begin to share, hey, what's it like for phase 1? What's it like for us to begin to really pray about creating a place that our city looks at and goes, man, that church is amazing because they open up the doors, just not on Sunday, but 7 days a week in order to bless our community. The idea that we want to see global partnerships, one of the things for me as we kind of pray, which by the way, so I asked this question of our 5 elders and our 7 staff. So we had 12 kind of these vision boards that we created. And so I took all 12 of everybody and said, hey, if God came and just did the unthinkable in 2025, what would Capstone look like? And so we created this crazy vision, which you're going to hear in the next month. But one of mine was I want to see Capstone have a gospel presence on 6 of the 7 continents. And originally it was on all 7 continents, but then I realized that Antarctica does not really have many people. So we're going to go with 6 out of 7. And so the understanding of, hey, if we're going to increase kingdom impact, then, hey, how are we building relationships with other missionaries around the world, or helping plant churches around the world, or going to unreached people groups, or how are we doing that? Because it's just not to seek the welfare of our city, but the idea that we seek the welfare of every city, and specifically the ones that God has blessed us to have relationships with, or that God calls us to. And so, yeah, in the next 3 years, I'd love to see that in 2025 in January, we get up and go, guys, hey, we hit it. We have been to 6 continents. We have partnerships in Asia. We have partnerships in Africa. And we have partnerships in Europe. And we have in South America. Here is what that looks like. And begin to really dream and pray. But guess what? If we only get 4 out of 6, hey, that's still pretty good. So I want us to begin to shoot, and I want us to begin to go and to have a direction in this quote-unquote desert time, that there's a direction that we're heading and that we're going to say, you know what? We're going to move forward. But can I tell you, it's not going to happen with just the people in this room. It's not going to happen with just the people that we have, because it's a lot to accomplish in the next 3 years to see fruit. But we've got to begin to go, hey, how am I growing as a disciple? How am I training my kids in the way of the Lord? Hey, how am I reaching my lost neighbor where I work, learn, live, and play? How am I doing that? Because we know there are tens of thousands, literally over 10,000 lost people within a 3-mile radius of this, and the amount of people moving to Fountain Inn is growing every single day. And so we have a choice. We can build a really cool church, or we can be a part of a gospel movement. And so if we kind of, you're like, well, wow, this is a lot of pressure. This is why we're not a big church, is because we expect a lot of our partners. We expect a lot of our Capstone family. We expect the idea of going, look, it's just not that we come to church, listen to a song, and listen to a sermon, but the idea that we go make this, and we be the hands and feet of Christ through ultimately developing missionary disciples. The idea that we want to multiply gospel movement, and that we want to see an increasing kingdom impact. Just not here, but around the world. So how can you help us do that as we advance together? Because it starts first individually with you. So if you're a guest here, hey, how can you begin to get plugged in to become a friend? If you've been a friend here and you're just kind of been hanging out, but then, hey, how's it get plugged in to be a family? If you're a family member, how do you go and disciple other people or beginning to have gospel conversations? If you're not serving in a service area, the idea that you would begin to go, hey, where can I begin to get plugged in? Because I want this to happen. I want to reach every man, woman, and child with repeated opportunity to hear, see, and respond to the gospel, just not only in Fountain Inn, but around the world. The idea that if we're really doing this, that we're probably going to have to go from 2 services to 3 services in the next year or 2. The idea that you're willing to serve in our Capstone Kids area, you're able to be a small group leader, or the idea that you can work with our teenagers, whatever it may be, but we can, hey, I want to buy into the advancement of the gospel and what this looks like. Here's my last thing. We've said this 13 years ago when Chris and Laura and Betsy and I sat around a table and dreamed this up. Look, this is not going to work unless God's in it. So one of our plumb lines, one of our slogans has always been, failure is certain unless God steps in. Failure is certain. There's no way this should work, whether it's through a merger or planting a church in Clinton or a 501c3 here for Fike, or whether going to Haiti and doing what we've done, or the tens of thousands of dollars that we've given to the city, to the hundreds of thousands of dollars that we've given away, that none of this should work unless God steps in. And every time I've come up with some crazy idea, someone has go, well, Walt, we don't have enough people for that. You're right. Let's see what God does. Hey, Walt, there's no way that we got the money for that. You're right. Let's see what God does. And even when I'm going to say this, the idea that we would have $1 million budget in 2025. Just like I thought there's no way we could pay that off. Just like I thought there'd nobody show up 13 years ago. God said, hey, Walt, in the last 13 years, have I not been faithful? That was put on your heart and other leaders at Capstone that I've been able to make that a reality. And I have to say, yeah, God, you're so good. And so we're casting some big vision, and failure is certain unless God steps in. So God's going to have to open some doors, just to be honest. God's going to have to soften some of our hearts. But it's not only God's got to step in, but also we have to step in. So do you have the courage when God gives you that opportunity to share the gospel? When God gives you that opportunity to disciple your son or daughter? Or God gives you the opportunity to host a community group? Or God gives you the opportunity to fly to Haiti or New Zealand or Brazil or wherever we're going to go? Will you have the courage to move forward? Because we can advance and God can open up doors. But unless we as individuals have the courage to do that, we can have clarity of where we're going. We can have confidence. But unless we have the courage to advance, it's not going to happen. And so that's all we come today to share. So the rest of the month, we're going to be going into deeper detail about those 3 values and how that's going to impact us. And I really believe these last 2 years have been challenging and hard. I'm going to go ahead and say this, and you can mark the tape. I don't really know what that means, but they say that on the radio all the time. But you can mark the tape. In 3 years, I believe that what we've experienced these past 2 years have been a foreshadowing of ultimately the courage and the confidence and the clarity to accomplish only what God can do, what we thought we couldn't do. So let's band together. Let's link arms as a gospel community and say, hey, let's advance together in the name of Jesus in Fountain Inn, in South Carolina, in the nation and the globe for his goodness and for his glory. Let's pray. Lord, we come to you now again, just thankful that our plans aren't just dependent on us. And God, that again, some of this just may be that we just had a bunch of cool stuff we wanted to do, but I really believe it's not going to come unless you're in it. So I pray, God, if we've made errors or if this is more our idea than yours, that you would shut doors and that we would change directions if we need to. But Lord, if these three things are your heart and the strategies we're going to talk about the rest of this month, Lord, if this is from you, Lord, I pray that you're going to send more leaders. God, that you're going to send those who are lost right now, who are going to be found, that there's someone right now who is far from you. They don't know you, Lord, but in the next year to 2 years, someone in this room is going to lead them to Christ. They're going to walk them through the waters of baptism. They're going to disciple them, and they're going to be part of helping in our third service. That they're going to give generously so that we can help build a community center for our city. That there are lost families surrounding us right now that are going to be vital parts of this mission and vision the next 3 years. Just like 13 years ago, some of the people in this room, they didn't know you, they didn't know me, they didn't know the Bible, but yet here today they sit. Here they sit as sons and daughters of you. So Lord, I pray that we would continue to pray that prayer for the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, however many years you continue to plug Capstone along, let's do it. God, I pray that we would still have the faith we had 13 years ago, that we were so young and dumb that we would do things where failure is certain unless you step in. God, this is your church, not ours. And we simply listen to your Holy Spirit. May you pour in us just an excitement and a boldness and a power that surprises even us. May we pray big prayers, expectant prayers, God, that you're going to move in mighty ways. I look forward to these next 3 years. Lord, I look forward to January 2025 and getting up and sharing all the things that you were accomplished through this group and those who are going to come in the years to come. Again, it's not by our strength. It's not by our power. It's not by ours. It's all by you. In your son's holy name we pray. Amen.